Hello, and welcome to episode 64 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Bloomington, Indiana, I'm Nick Zoutra. On today's podcast, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Matt Brown, Associate Professor of Philosophy and History of Ideas at the University of Texas at Dallas. The main areas of Matt's research and teaching at present deal with the intersection of science broadly construed with values broadly construed. He pursues these questions primarily as a philosopher of science and most notably as the director for the Center for Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology at the University of Texas at Dallas. The mission of this center is driven by several key ideas: innovation led by the heart as well as the head, science that is ethically and socially responsible, medicine practiced with compassion and wisdom, social and cultural change informed by the best science and technology, and using creativity, knowledge, and intelligence to make the world a better place in which to live. To subserve their mission, Matt and his team have established three objectives. Their first objective is to foster recognition of the many and complex ways that ethics, values, and culture interact with medicine, science, and technology. They work to make these issues visible to scientists, doctors, engineers, practitioners, innovators, students, policymakers, corporations, and the public at large. Beyond general visibility, their second objective is to foster a better understanding of the relationship between science and values by supporting and pursuing relevant research. So this includes investigations by scientists that shed light on their values and culture, by philosophers, humanities scholars, and social scientists on the nature of science and the role of values within it, and by ethicists and political theorists on the ethics and politics of science. Built upon an infrastructure of a careful understanding of values in science, the third objective of the center seeks to improve the relationship between science and values. Key to achieving this objective is connecting with the public, professionals, scientists, and policymakers over a variety of issues. The center wants to help the public know how to balance their cultural and moral commitments relative to the improvements in their lives offered by science, technology, and medicine. They want to help medical professionals balance compassionate care with safe and efficacious treatment. Matt wants to help scientists balance evidence with imagination, rigor with moral responsibility, and they want to also help policymakers learn how to integrate good science and democratic participation to promote the public good. For more about the center and more about Matt's research, without further ado, let's bring in Matt. Dr. Matthew J. Brown, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this Thursday morning?
I'm doing well, Nick. Thanks for having me.
Great. So how are things going? Where are you calling us from?
So I'm talking to you from my home in Dallas, Texas.
Yeah. How are things in Dallas this time of year?
It's a beautiful sunny day here in Dallas.
That's wonderful. I cannot say the same about Bloomington. It is spring came for about 2 seconds, and it is back into the 40s and cold and gray. No, but but I know it's coming up soon, so we should have some nice weather coming on. How's the spring semester been treating you in down there?
It's been going pretty well, busy, but a lot of good stuff going on. We're on spring break right now, so
woohoo, nice.
It's a relaxed week.
Fantastic. Teaching anything of interest this term?
I'm teaching 2 classes this term. I'm teaching a history and philosophy of science course for upper-level undergraduate students that's focused on gender in science and medicine. And I'm also teaching the sort of introductory seminar for our interdisciplinary PhD program in humanities.
Fascinating. Could you tell us a little bit about the focus of the Gender in Science and Medicine course?
Yeah, so it's looking at feminist philosophy of science and philosophy of medicine and other issues that come out of gender and gender bias in those fields. So we're looking at a lot of the classic papers in feminist philosophy of science. We're looking at a few key books in the field. Elizabeth Lloyd's book on the evolution of the female orgasm, Cordelia Fine's book on neurosexism, and Janet Craney's book on philosophy of science after feminism. That's sort of what we're focusing on.
Very cool, very cool. How are the students receiving it, engaging with the ideas?
Overall, they were a really engaged, interested group of students. Yeah. I mean, there's always a little bit of resistance from students who haven't thought about these things, maybe have some more traditional ideas about gender roles. But it's soft resistance so far. No, and a lot of real strong interest, actually. Good engagement in that class.
Cool. Good to hear. Have you taught it before?
This is my second time teaching it.
Okay. Cool. And how are things going with the, I know you're currently the director for the Center for Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology. How are things going with that?
Going really well. So the center's two main activities are, we run a conference every year, usually in May. This is our 9th conference coming up. Just about, probably on Saturday, going to publish the program for the conference, but we've done all the acceptances and we're close to getting everything in order. So that's been going really well. I'm looking forward to that. We also do a lecture series for a general audience, open to the public audience on our campus every spring. We're about halfway through it now. We just had a couple of weeks ago Don Howard, a philosopher of science, talking to us about artificial intelligence and ethics. So,
cool.
Yeah, it was really interesting.
Nice, very nice. Well, let's before we go a little bit more into the current research and what's going on, let's take a step back to learn a little bit about your history, Matt. Tell us, before you came to Dallas as a philosopher of science of values, where did you grow up?
Yeah, good. So I grew up outside of Atlanta in a little suburb, Lilburn, Georgia, close to Stone Mountain, Georgia. You might have heard of Stone Mountain.
Yeah.
So I grew up there, went to high school there, and ended up going to college just down the road at Georgia Tech.
Yeah. I'm familiar with their bit of their philosophy and psychology stuff going on.
Yeah.
What were things like in Stone Mountain? And I'm looking at the image. This is amazing. I actually, I think I've heard of this, but I've never seen it. This is pretty incredible.
So, Lilburn was a pretty established suburb. Good high school. That's why my parents moved there. It was a good schools. Standard southern suburban experience. Stone Mountain, which is the big landmark in the area, is a big Confederate war monument, where it's this kind of natural granite. I forget the name of the geological formation, but it's basically a dome of granite that's pushed up out of the ground. It's a really beautiful natural formation. And then they put this relief of these, Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee and so forth on it.
Sure.
And it's a big park. It was a public state park. I think it's now been given away to a private company or sold off to a private company. But when I was a kid, it was a state park. You would go there in the summer for picnics. They do a laser show on the mountain, that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, I grew up in a pretty typical suburban town. Both of my parents worked in medicine, broadly speaking. My mom was a nurse. My dad was a cardiovascular tech. I guess it's not a doctor, but someone who was like a research and practice technical assistant at Emory University Medical School.
Very nice. So this might be a difficult question. What did you think about medicine growing up? Or
Yeah, it's a good question. Sorry, was there a follow-up part
nope,
of that?
that's it.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you one thing is that I don't get like freaked out or nauseated by medical talk like some people do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because that was just sort of dinner table conversation at my house. Was weird and gross things that happened in the hospital. So it was normal to be in the hospital. It was normal to talk about medical issues. So I was not particularly. I never myself got particularly interested in medicine.
Mm-hmm.
Like I didn't want to, there's not a time in my life where I wanted to be a doctor. I'm still quite comfortable talking and thinking about
nothing about nothing about the particularly graphic stories were motivating to get working.
No.
Okay. Cool. But yeah, so exposed to it at an early age. So what, if not medicine, what were you interested in?
I was like largely interested in science and technology stuff. I loved playing with computers.
Mm-hmm.
When I was 10 or 12 years old, my dad got us a IBM clone 386 computer with DOS and Windows 3.0. And I remember spending a lot of time on the computer, learning about dial-up bulletin board systems and so forth. So I did a lot of that. I was interested. I read a lot about robotics and physics. I got really interested in sort of popular books about modern physics, relativity, and quantum mechanics and stuff. I really stuck with those things. Into freshman year of college when I started at Georgia Tech as a double major in computer science and physics.
Oh wow! Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us. I guess we can start doing that. You got the physics bug. You got the understanding the strong study of nature. What? So what were you thinking early on in terms of pursuing those pretty challenging double majors?
Yeah. I mean, I was interested in, I guess, thinking back now with, a little bit more vocabulary than I had then, I was interested in the theory side of both of those things, right? So when I was taking computer classes, like computer programming classes in high school, I was really interested in the kind of data structures, algorithms, part of it. Similarly, when I was, thinking about physics, I was interested in the theory, not so much the mathematical part of it, but the big ideas, right? Mm-hmm. That's what I sort of, so that informed my decision for college. And, I ended up going to Georgia Tech. I actually only applied to Georgia Tech and got in. At the time, the state of Georgia had this great lottery-funded scholarship program for all students. If you met a minimum threshold for your grades, tuition was free at any public school, and so that made staying in state, an obvious decision.
Yeah.
Great program. I don't think it doesn't exist in the same form that it existed then. But anyway, what I quickly learned from my college classes was, especially getting past the first year of classes, was that the computer science major was really preparing you for a job in industry doing sort of software engineering, which I quickly became bored with. Just not interested in. I did have friends who were computer science majors who did end up, finding the sort of other theory-oriented classes and ended up going, to grad school and doing the kind of stuff that I was interested in. But, you had to kind of make it past a certain number of these drudgery software engineering classes I couldn't stand.
Yeah.
So I first sort of dropped the computer science part of what I was doing after my third semester. And that was also when I started taking philosophy classes. And I kept going with physics until, I graduated with a physics degree, but I, over time, became similarly disaffected with physics. For two reasons, really. One is I just couldn't stand the lab classes. And I thought that was just drudgery. Two, I was really lucky to have the opportunity to do a research experience for undergraduates one summer, and work with one of the theory professors at Georgia Tech. She was excited to work with me because I had some background as a computer science student. But it turns out that a lot of theory in physics is today is very computer algorithm oriented. Not all of it, but a lot of it.
So by computer algorithm oriented. So what's an example of what a theoretical physicist, what would do? So if you were to say, if it was to take yourself, you were to shadow a theoretical physicist, what exactly would be going on? What would you be doing?
Yeah, I can tell you the project I was actually working on.
Perfect.
So she was a theorist working mainly on, nanomaterials physics, right? So nanotubes, buckyballs, nanobelts, these small nanostructure, these nanostructure materials where they are small enough that sort of quantum and atomic forces are relevant, but they're large enough where you start to think about major applications of them, real world applications of them, right? People want to use these things to build actual cables and things that you can do stuff with, right? And so it's an interesting domain for the theorist because it crosses this boundary of the quantum scale and the macroscopic scale, right? But in practice, what they end up doing is working a lot because of the scale. Because at the scale you can't really do first principles calculations with precision. It's a lot of computer modeling, right? And approximation. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to figure out which details to pick and choose from the quantum and classical domain, basically, to put into your computer models to try to match first what we know from observation about these things and then make predictions, right?
Okay.
But in my case, it meant learning Fortran, which is a terrible programming language, and trying to learn how to translate between Fortran and some other more recent programming language, in order to pull some libraries together and start plugging the data in for these nanobelt crystal lattices.
Wow.
It was a really boring summer.
It sounds like a lot of real experimental work that involves a lot of modeling, a lot of some heavy lifting with building the models, running the models, and Yeah, just I mean, quite a bit of that particular kind of work. So
right.
yeah, I could totally understand. Maybe not being as excited about it.
Yeah. I mean, I fell in love with physics reading about what Einstein did, what Bohr and Heisenberg did, and the big stuff, the big idea stuff, and that's what excited me. And at the same time I was doing this work, I was learning about Plato and Descartes and Hume and Kuhn and Feyerabend, and
Right.
I was seeing the sort of big idea work happening somewhere else, about science, about the scientific stuff I was interested in, happening somewhere else. So,
gotcha. Was there? I mean, so in doing the particular kind of theoretical work, though, I mean, is there any way? At what points do you connect that work with big idea stuff?
yeah.
Or is there a potential for that, or is that even valued within the field?
My experience, which a lot of other philosophers of science that I've talked to have had this experience of going into physics at first, and then having an interest in the big idea stuff, and the scientists just aren't interested in it. For the most part, the physics faculty that I would talk to had the classic shut up and calculate mentality, right? Which you hear, there's a lot of people have talked about how disaffecting this is, right? And so I encountered that from pretty much everyone, with one exception. The professor in physics who ended up being my physics mentor, David Finkelstein. David Finkelstein is actually known to philosophers a little bit because in the 70s he was part of the discussion in Foundations of Quantum Mechanics emphasizing quantum logic. Right? So he was an early proponent of quantum logic, along with Hilary Putnam and a couple of other folks. And so he had kind of moved on from that stuff, but he was still, a big ideas person, very open to talking about the philosophical implications of everything he was doing. And so I ended up doing my senior project with him, and he was great, right? The work I've done in philosophy of physics is like very inspired by the work that he did.
Oh, great!
And what I learned from him. For the most part, it was a very alienating culture with respect to what I was actually interested in, the sort of philosophical and theoretical questions.
Sure. Yeah. And I can certainly relate with the really being fascinated by the big ideas, being initially interested in that, but then being a little bit dissatisfied with what it would actually mean then working in that particular context. Not in physics, but just in other sciences. I think there's a similar feel sometimes where there might be a lack of. If you're particularly focused and encouraged by the big ideas, it's harder to really be about it. And now, as a working philosopher of science, I find we love the big ideas, but we're even narrowing down very much so.
Sure.
All the time, and even more encouraging that. But there's definitely not a shut up and calculate mentality, which is nice. So tell us about the turn to doing philosophy of science, to making your way into a program, and how you developed your approach.
Yeah. So I got into philosophy my second year of college. I had a friend, still a good friend of mine, who saw me sitting outside of our calculus class reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert Pirsig, and she's which I had been given by a friend, and she said, there's this class you can take about that kind of stuff. She told me about it, and so the next year I signed up for a like History of Philosophy 1 class, like ancient philosophy. And it was a really spellbinding lecturer, professor. His name was John Johnston. Mm-hmm. And I was immediately captured by it. And then I started taking classes in philosophy of science, epistemology, environmental philosophy, those kinds of things. I found it really refreshing and great. So I decided I wanted to, instead of sticking with physics, I wanted to go to grad school and do philosophy of science, probably philosophy of physics, because that's what I knew the most about and was most interested in. And so, although I was also interested in some general philosophy of science stuff. So I ended up getting into grad school at UC San Diego, and went there with, I went there with a very eclectic undergraduate education in philosophy, sort of whatever classes I had pulled together from the small program that was there that included a historian of philosophy, John Johnston, an environmental philosopher and pragmatist named Brian Norton. And so I was really interested in pragmatism. And I had picked up somehow a really strong interest in Paul Feyerabend, which, always makes for a quirky experience. And so I came to grad school with like a much less standard set of knowledge and attitudes than many of the other students in my cohort and in the program. Anyway, UC San Diego is a good place to do philosophy of science. I developed very early a good relationship with Paul Churchland, who, although he's most well known as a philosopher of mind and philosopher of neuroscience, that all for him comes out of like a real strong grounding in philosophy of science. And he shared my interest in Feyerabend and in pragmatism, and then a little later on in my graduate career, got to know Nancy Cartwright, and again, she's got a kind of a sort of sympathy for pragmatism of a broad sort. And so when I discovered that the stuff in philosophy of physics that I was most interested in wasn't where the field really was, and I can talk a little bit more about that, I ended up deciding I was going to work on more general issues in philosophy of science and in pragmatism.
Okay.
And somewhere in the middle of graduate school, I got particularly really interested in the work of John Dewey. And so my dissertation ended up being sort of 1/4 history of philosophy, trying to unpack Dewey's philosophy of science, and then 3/4 taking what I had kind of pulled together and applying it in different areas of contemporary concern in philosophy of science.
Okay. So, that's a really great and interesting turn. What kinds of projects were you and did you focus on at this time?
Yeah. So besides the more historical work, just trying to, because Dewey has not been read except by a very few people as a philosopher of science. Philosophy of education, yes. Political philosophy, right. Yes. There's at the time there was a very influential interpretation of him as a philosopher of technology. But not a lot of people had written about his philosophy of science. So that was, saying where I thought the center of interest in his philosophy of science was a big part of the dissertation work. And then I looked at some problems having to do with evidence, nature of evidence, with models and pluralism, and with science and values. So the last part of the dissertation looked at Philip Kitcher's work in Science, Truth, and Democracy on what counted as significant truth, the sort of value-laden notion of significant truth.
Oh, wow.
And sort of, use this sort of Deweyan approach to critically evaluate and provide an alternative way of thinking about that. And that was sort of my entree into science and values, into the science and values literature.
Yeah, 'cause I was really interested in this turn from philosophy of physics to then history of philosophy of science to science and values. So, tell us a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, and it, I came across Kitcher just in a class I was sitting in on, about a year into my dissertation work. I thought it was really interesting. I had already earlier picked up an interest in science and values from, I think, mainly from sitting in on the science studies STS colloquium at UCSD. But I just was sort of hunting for interesting things going on in philosophy of science that I thought Dewey had something to speak to. And so the Kitcher stuff seemed like a really obvious case for me, because Dewey's philosophy of science is sort of centered around, and pragmatism really generally is centered around this idea that, inquiry attacks problems. It's a problem-solving process, and it's important to distinguish, genuine problems from sort of intellectual sort of fantasies, right? I mean, like what I think Peirce calls paper problems, right? So I was already sort of poised to think about things in that way. What makes for a genuine problem? And here's Kitcher talking about how we rank sort of research questions for science, right? Using both our knowledge of the field and also social values, and I thought this was it ended up being, I think, a good connection. But through that, I started thinking about science and values more generally, and so the first graduate course I taught after I got my PhD and got my job at UT Dallas was on science values and democracy, and it was, in that year, sort of finishing my dissertation, preparing to go to teach.
Yeah,
I discovered the work of Heather Douglas, which has been really influential on me, and just a wide variety of things going on. And I got a much better sense of the field of feminist philosophy of science. I was able to go back to stuff in environmental philosophy that I hadn't thought about in a while and pull those things together. And the bulk of my focus since I finished the dissertation has been on this science and value stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So for those of us who and those listeners who are not as familiar with science and values, feminist philosophy of science, what are some of the general questions that science that are sort of particularly of interest to those in the science and values literature, particular questions that you found yourself initially interested in, and how does this approach differ from, or what is particularly unique or special about taking an approach when you're studying values in science?
Yeah, good. So I mean, it starts off from a very common idea and from an observation, right? So the common idea is that this this image of science that we all in some sense have of science is this kind of objective pursuit, right? It's supposed to be this objective truth-seeking thing, right? And part of the package that goes along with that in sort of the everyday imagination is that values have nothing to do with it, right? That it's a value-free enterprise, right? And a lot of scientists and philosophers have held this up as an ideal, as the value-free ideal for science. But there's a worry when we compare this, when we make an observation about actual science, which is that the values are all over it, right? So in the context of feminist philosophy of science, there is just the long history of sexist, androcentric bias and misogyny in the history of science. For in environmental science, it's the long history of conflicts between industry and non-industry scientists over a variety of environmental questions, where there seems to be it just so happens, right, that the results line up with the interests of the companies, or they don't, depending on whether the companies are funding them, and so on, right? So there's and from psychology, right, the psychology of motivated reasoning, we know that human beings are always, engaged in some kind of bias, right? And so the question that motivates the science and values literature is, how do we reconcile this ideal with this observation, right? And so, early work in science and values, the aim was just to say, this is science falling down on the job, and the important thing is to get back to the ideal, right? But then, for example, again, in feminist philosophy of science, they looked at the scientists, the feminist scientists whose work they admired, right? Who they thought were, fighting sexism, were getting rid of sexist bias. Mm-hmm. And that work wasn't motivated by, objectivity and neutrality. It was motivated by feminist values, right? Mm. And so the natural question arises, is, maybe actually we shouldn't be thinking about getting rid of bias. We should be thinking about which values should play a role in science and how they should play a role in science. And I think, one of the really, really important moves in this literature, in the last 20 plus years, it's an idea that goes back further, but is the one that Heather Douglas makes about inductive risk, right? So the idea that Heather Douglas had is, if we look at a hypothesis and we want to know whether we should accept the hypothesis or not, and we've got data that supports it, right? We ask, is that enough data to accept the hypothesis? And it turns out that answering that question, you make a trade-off, right? If you have a very high bar for accepting the hypothesis, then you're going to be less likely to be fooled by accepting something that's false, right? But you're going to have a correspondingly high rate of error in rejecting a lot of things that are true, or failing to accept a lot of things that are true. If you lower the bar, you get the complementary trade-off, right? You are more likely to accept true things, right? But also more likely to have to accept false things, right? So you're more permissive, right? But your false positive error rate, as they call it, goes up. And this is an idea that's, I mean, it's not new, right? It was a topic of much conversation in the 50s and early 60s in philosophy of science, and Heather Douglas rightly cites people like Hempel and Richard Rudner, especially, and C. West Churchman, who brought this out very clearly at that time. Although I think the argument and P.D. Magnus realized that this argument actually is just William James's argument from The Will to Believe, right?
Yeah.
William James says, believe truth and shun error, right? These are the laws of logic, but they're actually two different laws that pull in opposite directions, right?
Yeah.
I thought it was really nice when P.D. Magnus sort of pulled out that connection. So it's an old argument, but when Heather Douglas brought it back to our attention around 2000 in her article, I think it had a really big, important impact on the field, because it makes us realize not only is the ideal of value-free science something that is hard, if not impossible, to meet in practice, but it actually might not even be ideal in principle.
Yeah.
Right? Because if we have these trade-offs, right, and if it matters which thing we believe, right, then we actually kind of have a responsibility to manage the trade-off in the right way.
Yeah.
And that management, I mean, that requires ethical or value judgments.
What is the trace back to the historical origins of the value-free ideal?
It's murky. I mean, there are things like the value-free ideal going all the way back to Plato, right? It's tied up with the contrast between reason and emotion, right?
Sure.
And so there's a bunch of different versions of it that appear historically. I mean, in terms of contemporary science, a lot of people trace the ideal to Max Weber in his discussion of the vocation of the scientist. Although I think Weber actually, it's kind of complicated, right? Weber's worried about the importation of like moralistic language into social science, like using moralistic terms to categorize people, because that reproduces prejudice. But it's not clear that his understanding of what social science should be was totally value-free in the way that we think about it today.
Sure.
The contemporary form of the value-free ideal that philosophers of science care about really started to arise in the work of what's sometimes called the right-wing Vienna Circle, right? The logical positivists or logical empiricists who were less concerned with social science and the relationship of science to science and political issues. So Reichenbach is an example here, whose context of discovery, context of justification distinction, according to which the real action in science is the logical relationships of justification between evidence and theory, or evidence and hypothesis, and all the stuff that actually goes into producing the science is kind of irrelevant psychological detail. That's one place where this comes about. Within the scientific community, you've got a really clear statement of it in 1945 with Vannevar Bush's report to the president on the state of science post World War II and his recommendation for the creation of the National Science Foundation. He focused in that report on the importance of basic research cut off from thoughts of application, right? And so that's thought to be one example within the scientific community of really thinking about pure science independent from society is the real action, right? And the social benefit of science being an inevitable result of that sort of trickle down. It's sort of trickle down epistemology, right? that we would get good practical results if we funded basic research as a sort of side effect. I mean,
yeah. Well, thank you for this brief and informative historical overview of these traces. So there's a lot of good questions, a lot of interesting areas to explore. So tell us a little bit about then your own work in science and values, and perhaps is your work as director for the Center for Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology.
Sure. So my work in science and values, I think of it as there's sort of three and a half phases of it, right? So let's say two and a half phases of it. So the first phase, which I was working on until maybe 2.5 years ago, was sort of trying to understand the assumptions in the literature and interrogate them from a broadly pragmatist perspective. So looking at, I talked about Kitcher a lot already, looking at the work of Heather Douglas, Janet Karani, a bunch of other people in the field, and kind of critically responding to it in pointing out what I thought was missing. And the core thing I thought was missing was that folks weren't taking the values side of it seriously enough. That is, they sort of were talking about, we need to have values in science, and we need to sort of figure out how to have values in science in a way that doesn't corrupt scientific integrity or objectivity. But my thought was that they weren't taking seriously the possibility that values were not just sort of subjective preferences, but themselves the product, sometimes at least, of reflective judgment, right? So there was a kind of lurking ethical non-cognitivism. Not surprisingly, I mean, ethical non-cognitivism basically comes out of philosophy of science in the logical empiricists. But I thought, this was a kind of uninterrogated assumption, and so I was trying to interrogate it. And then more recently, I have been working on trying to provide that alternative, tried to provide a way of thinking about value judgments in science as not merely sort of these subjective biasing factors, right? Yeah. And here I'm really inspired by the work of Elizabeth Anderson on this stuff, who's also a Dewey pragmatist and feminist philosopher of science. And Elizabeth Anderson, in a great paper, 2004 paper on uses of value judgments in science, was probably the first person to identify this problem in philosophy of not taking the status of value judgments seriously. And so I've been trying to do that. I've been relying on Dewey and some contemporary pragmatists in the ethical space who are thinking about what they call moral imagination as a way of thinking about value judgment. And so my book manuscript, which is currently under review at a publisher, is called Science and Moral Imagination, a New Ideal for Values in Science.
Oh, great.
It tries to really take on that task and provide the motivation for needing a theory of value judgment in science, and then providing that theory and showing how to apply it in scientific inquiry.
Yeah. Really, fascinating. Yeah, so I'm seeing a little bit over here that the book argues that very few, if any, of the decisions scientists face, and in principle, can be decided just by logic and evidence alone. Nor are epistemic standards sufficient.
Right.
So what could you tell us a little bit about this theory that you lay out?
Yeah. So it comes from a few different sources. One is Dewey's theory of values and value judgment, which he laid out in a number of places, but especially in his work in the 1930s. He has a book, actually, it's called Theory of Valuation, and it's actually his contribution to the International Encyclopedia of the Unified Sciences, which, as you might know, or historians of philosophy of science might know, is the big Neurath-Carnap publishing venture, right? Which also produced Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions as its very last volume. Looking at that, looking at Mark Johnson's pragmatist-inspired work on ethics and cognitive science, on moral imagination, and what I try to basically lay out is that there's a really analogous process in making a value judgment to the process of scientific inquiry, right? They're both problem-solving processes. They're both evidence relevant. They both draw on evidence, but they're not simple induction from evidence, right? So I try to draw out that analogy, both because I think at a sort of philosophical level, it makes it clear how values are not just a sort of negative interfering effect or process in science, but also because I'm interested in targeting scientists too, right? And because ultimately they're the ones who have to make a lot of these value judgments in the course of scientific inquiry that we're talking about. And they already know how to do scientific inquiry, right? And so if they can see the analogy to what they already do and the process of value judgment, I think that helps at a pedagogical level, right? So if that's a principle, if as I try to argue that's a principled analogy, that there really is a connection there, then I think that helps the case for that ultimate application as well.
Very cool. What's some perhaps anticipated pushback you might get about that?
Sure. Well, I mean, the value-free ideal itself is alive and well, right? And in philosophy of science and in scientific circles. So there's, I've talked to plenty of people who just can't get past the idea that values or social interests or whatever in science are going to inevitably bias people and lead to wishful thinking, right? It's just science is going to just become wishful thinking, right? That's one way to put it. One way people do put it. Another place for pushback is, a lot of people have a hard time thinking that that values are anything but subjective. So they will push back from a place of pluralism or disagreement at the level of values and say, look, people have different values, right? People in different cultures, people on different sides of the political aisle disagree about substantive values questions. And so the attempt to use inquiry to find a right answer to a values question is wrong-headed in a democratic society. And that's I think an important objection, but I don't agree. Obviously, I don't think that's the right way to understand disagreement about value judgments. And the third place where I anticipate resistance is, and I've seen a little bit of resistance, is even if you accept that value judgments do have, a non-subjective status, even if you do think that science has got to be value-laden, that the value-free ideal is wrong, you might still think I'm going too far in the way I talk about the ubiquity of value judgments in science, and the way in which values can always impact, what we accept and what we doubt in science. For example, you might say, look, values are relevant, but if you look at climate change, for example, there's just no reason to doubt the climate science based on, if you value, energy intensive activities, right? I think that's wrong. You might have a reason to doubt. It doesn't mean that your all things considered right decision is to doubt, right? But that should at least give you pause, right? And you need to think about both how to evaluate the evidence and how to think about that driving value as well. I think that's where the resistance is going to be towards my account.
Yeah, I hear you. Okay. So one area that I have my own particular interest, and maybe you could speak to how your work in thinking of applied is in psychiatry. So in psychiatry, there's a focus on understanding and explaining mental function and mental dysfunction. Sure. And there's even research, particularly at the National Institute of Mental Health, that is looking to explain particular behaviors and symptoms in terms of failure modes or potential causes of dysfunction. They use this term literally as a mode is going into failure, and and this is very common, I imagine, in terms of medicine, where we talk about function and dysfunction. So how could you, in terms of understanding and explaining values related to these particular concepts, especially we just talk about function, dysfunction. What does your work or thoughts on what does your work say or potentially have insight in relation to understanding the way in which we conceptualize and describe or explain these kind of phenomena? Yeah,
good. So I think in psychiatry or medicine broadly, it's a particularly clear case because the aims themselves are obviously value laden.
Right.
So it's interesting. The particular language that you use of function and dysfunction is interesting because sometimes that language is used instead of the language of health and disease,
right,
to avoid the appearance of sounding like value laden, right?
Or it still is, but yeah,
right. But the point is, what counts as a dysfunction is ultimately based on what we care about, right? What we want to see, how we want our mood and behavior and cognition to operate, right? So there you have to, I think so my work would have us ask questions about the way in which, for example, diagnostic categories in psychiatry or even causal explanations or choice of interventions are the ways in which various things are being operationalized, measured, and explained, tracking the aim that we ultimately have there, right? A lot of approaches in science and values, not just my approach, would say that. But it's easy to get lost in that kind of pursuit by replacing what is easily measurable with what we ultimately care about. I think the instruments we use to measure depression are a great example of this, right? It's a score based on a catalog of things that's fairly easy to measure or get responses from a patient on, but and it's validatable in a construct validity or internal validity kind of way.
Sure.
But there's a lot of critiques, a lot of questions about whether the changes in that scale map onto the things that we care about as patients or concerned parties, right?
Yeah.
And so we have to, I think about adding another layer of evaluation on top of these things, right? Not only the technical evaluation, but also, ultimately, does this map onto our values and our goals?
Yep.
Right. Yeah.
Very good. Very good. Okay. No, I appreciate you mentioning that, commenting on that. So you mentioned the book is in review. Does that mean it's pretty much complete, working through it, or what's?
Yeah. So my version is done. And
Okay.
So that the full manuscript is under review. I'm hoping to hear any day now about the reviews of it, and whether the publisher will accept it or not. Yeah.
Well, here's hoping. Yeah, no, but it sounds fascinating. I'm very excited to read, and once it comes out, it does look very Look, I think hopefully it'll be particularly useful for philosophers of science and scientists alike. Or at least it'll be pretty informative. Well, so I guess we're getting a little bit closer to our time, but I feel like we've just scratched the surface about a little bit of some of your work. So now that you're waiting for the reviews, are there any current projects or current potential projects you've been thinking about exploring?
Yeah, good question. There's a couple of things. So one thing which I didn't mention yet, but I did a paper, a sort of science and values analysis of the work of a psychologist named William Moulton Marston.
Uh-huh.
Marston did a lot of things, but he created the lie detector test. He created the comic book character Wonder Woman, and all of that is related to a sort of a deeper well of psychological experimental results and psychological theory, and radical feminist politics. And so I tried to sort of bring out some of those connections in my paper, but I really only scratched the surface of it in a very long paper. So I am thinking about going back to that topic. There's a lot of things left to say that are interesting. So that's a much more it seems like a narrow case maybe, but I think it's a really rich one that I'd like to spend some more time on. I also in the book don't address a lot of the larger sort of political and policy issues related to science, and so I think that's a realm that I have explored a little bit in some of my papers and would like to spend some more time with. And then I've also increasingly been interested in revisiting one of the topics from my dissertation work on broadly pluralism, perspectivism, models, and sort of scientific metaphysics stuff. So that's something I'm at least sort of starting to toy with getting back into. So that's where I'm thinking about going next. But we'll see.
Absolutely. So I guess let me ask the final question that I'd like to ask a number of the guests, which is, what do you take to be the greatest challenge facing philosophy of science today?
Yeah, I think the greatest challenge facing philosophy of science today is relevance, right? How is the field going to be, as I think it really desires to be, socially relevant, without sort of losing its status as philosophy? And you can see the pull of this problem actually in the careers of individual philosophers of science, where those who end up going, really, really very much into these sort of policy-focused, socially relevant topics, have end up wandering off into the real world as opposed to staying in the academic discussion. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it is a kind of if only the people with sort of recherche scholastic interests stick around in academia, that has an effect on the next generation of philosophers of science. So, I mean, there's a bunch of different ways. It's not just science and values stuff, but there's a bunch of different ways in which philosophers of science are increasingly focused on being socially relevant. And the question in my mind is, how do we learn to do that and keep that a part of philosophy of science rather than sort of spinning it off?
Very good question. More typical question: how do we become? So, what are some practical solutions to this? What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think we have to be a little bit more mindful of the biases that we're bringing to hiring and promotion processes, right? What kind of work we value there. A lot of philosophers of science are interested in public work, broadly speaking.
Yep.
But it's something that they either have to do on the side or if they make it the center of their work, it becomes a real problem for their advancement in the field because of the biases and processes. Yeah.
Right.
So we have to figure out how to revise those. That's the most practical thing, is we have to revise the way we think about what we reward in the field.
Very cool. Have you heard of this? There's a conference I'll be attending and giving a talk this coming week. It's the Mid-South Philosophy of Science Conference.
I have heard of that. It's Julie Burston?
Yeah.
Organizing it? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's a good mix of different folks, but the theme was on social engagement, potentially even with a regional focus. So it's that which not necessarily, but often will include some kind of public engagement with public issues, or even just issues related to regional focus, even in the Midwest and the Mid-South. It just in general, like given that the nature of that kind of work, you're going to see a greater relevance come about.
Right.
I just wondered if, I don't know. Yeah. So perhaps something like that I'd be interested. So I don't know. Is there anything, any questions or anything to take to that conference, you think? Anything or conversations to be had?
Yeah. It's a good question. I would say, insofar as people are talking about doing that kind of work, ask them whether they're being supported, right, by their departments, by their colleagues. I'm also increasingly interested in where the next generation of graduate students are getting trained, right, and whether the people who are successful in this kind of work are able to teach in programs that are turning out graduate students, right? So you could ask them how they're bringing this into graduate education. I think is an important thing to talk about.
Okay. Well, Matt, Dr. Matthew J. Brown, thank you so much for taking the time to chat this afternoon or this morning. Hope things are going well for you in Dallas. Is there anything else you'd like to leave us with, or anything we didn't quite get to in our chat?
Well, I didn't say maybe as much as I could about the Center for Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology.
Yeah. Maybe you can leave us with some info about that.
So we're coming up on the 10th anniversary of the center.
Congratulations.
And so we'll be having our 10th annual conference in 2020. And we're really looking at different ways of becoming more of a force in our community, but also within the philosophy of science community. And so I would encourage your listeners to keep an eye out for our call for papers for our annual conference next year.
Oh, great.
As well as keep your eye out for announcements of new initiatives that you might get to participate in.
Okay. Yeah, we'll do, definitely. Maybe I can include a link in the show notes. Definitely a reference.
Great.
Do you guys have any social media presence at the moment?
We do. Our website is values.utdallas.edu.
Okay.
We're on Twitter at Values in Science.
Okay.
And we also have a Facebook page.
Awesome. That's what you got to do these days.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you again. Yeah, Matt, thank you so much for coming on and chatting. Definitely do hope to look out for your book. Hopefully the publishers, fingers crossed, will put it through. And anyway, I hope we can meet at a conference or two or something in the near future.
Great. Well, it's been my pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day. And talk to you soon.
Thanks.